request for an increase of 500 billion euros. The Eurozone has committed already 150 billion euros. So you can calculate in which ballpark, in which range of hundreds of billions we are talking about when we talk about reinforced financial firewalls for the sake of safeguarding financial stability in Europe.
Minister Schäuble, Chancellor Merkel has made some bold statements about the long term and what needs to be done over the long term. But as we sit here today, the short term seems quite critical as we await a decision between Greece and its creditors. What is the plan over the short term?
First remark is you never must do the opposite in the short term. You have to do it in the long term. Because if you want to regain credibility, you have to do the same in the same direction, in the short term and the long term. That is one of the critical issues, and therefore we are working on fighting the reasons of the crisis, and we have do what is needed, and we will decide what will be needed to buy the necessary time we need to. In the short term, we are negotiating with Greece. Greece is a very specific case. You can't take any consequence for any other member states in the euro. It's totally different. It's a very specific case in Greece. We need a reduction of the deaths, and that it has been approved that the Greece has to be reduced by the private sectors in 50%. And we are negotiating the final negotiations, and we were very clear on Monday in the Eurogroup that we need for a new program for Greece a debt sustainability, and that means the overall debt in Greece not over 120% GDP in 2020. That has to be achieved. It's not easy, but it's possible, and it will be done in the coming days. I'm quite optimistic. Then we need a new program in Greece. And Greece has, and that is maybe the most critical issue, and we discussed it very clear on Monday, and Mario Draghi, the ECB, was very clear, IMF was very clear. Greece has not only to commit itself, Greece has to deliver, because Greece has committed itself 2 years ago, and not all of the commitments has been delivered and fulfilled. And that is one of the critical issues to regain confidence, and that has to be done in Greece, and we must not give the wrong incentives. No firewall. You can make any firewall, any figure. It will not work if the real problems will not be solved.
I would like to get all of your takes on something that has been talked about very much in the market, and that is, of course, a default in Greece. What is the worst-case scenario? Many people expect Greece to default. What's the worst-case scenario, Minister Schäuble?
We don't expect a default in Greece. I know that most participants in markets have for a long time in-priced this. But I don't expect a default in Greece. I am sure that if everyone is ready to deliver what has been agreed, and all the partners of Greece are ready to do it, we will avoid, we can avoid, and we will avoid a default of Greece. But of course, the private sector has to take its responsibility. That has been agreed first time in July, in the summit of July last year. It's not a new story. And now we are discussing the concrete figures. And I am quite optimistic we can avoid it. But it depends on that Greece is ready to deliver and to fulfill its commitment.
Minister Barron.
D'abord, je voudrais dire, avec tout le respect que j'ai pour cette honorable assistance, qu'il ne s'agit pas d'une séance de négociation de l'Eurogroupe. C'est un point important, puisque la question que vous avez soulevée sur la question du pare-feu est une question essentielle dans nos discussions avec Wolfgang et les autres collègues ministres des Finances. Nous considérons, c'est la position que la France défend, que plus le pare-feu est élevé, moins il aura à être utilisé. C'est le principe de l'élément de dissuasion. La leçon, ou l'une des leçons de ces crises que nous tirons, c'est qu'il faut traiter le cas grec, éviter la contagion, mettre en place les dispositifs de consolidation budgétaire, de convergence budgétaire, fiscale, économique. Pour que la discipline ait un sens, il faut des sanctions. Nous avons beaucoup avancé dans nos discussions avec Wolfgang et avec les autres collègues sur les éléments de sanctions, sur le niveau de déficit structurel, sur le niveau de référence concernant le pacte de stabilité et de croissance. Nous avons encore un petit débat sur la référence à la dette. Ça fait partie des discussions. Et nous devons avancer au même rythme, avec la même intensité, sur le chemin de la solidarité. Le chemin de la solidarité, il a déjà pris une forme. On anticipe le mécanisme durable de protection. On l'anticipe de plus de 6 mois. Et si on peut aller plus vite, on essaiera d'aller plus vite, mais de plus de 6 mois. Et nous devons accompagner, en effet, cette idée que le pare-feu est probablement la meilleure des réponses. Voilà. C'est un élément du débat, c'est un élément de la discussion. Je dois la vérité de dire que nous n'allons pas traiter aujourd'hui ce point, mais qu'il sera naturellement à l'ordre du jour de la réunion des chefs d'État et de gouvernement lundi prochain.
Well, I also think that it's very simple to try to focalize the future of the Eurozone on the problems of Greece with its creditors, but I think that this is an oversimplification. I think that much more important than that is the actions that I think that we are taking in order to improve the institutional framework of the Eurozone in the future, to avoid the mistakes that we made in the past, and to have a much more united common currency area. And in that regard, I think that, for instance, the discussion that we are having about the fiscal compact, even the willing and the purpose of the different governments to deliver, I think that is going to be the key element. It's going to be the key element in that regard. For sure that we are going to need firewalls, backstops, with ample liquidity, with a lot of resources. But I think that at the end of the day, the vital element to restore confidence on the future of the Eurozone is going to be, the institutional framework that we are going to put in place, and simultaneously the degree of commitment of the domestic governments with the institutional framework and with the rest of the partners of the Eurozone. And in that regard, the perception, I am the younger in arriving to office, in this club. But, the perception that I have, and the perception that I have obtained, is that there is a, growing consensus that, this is the way forward. We have a problem with Greece. We have a problem with other countries of the past. But we have, a concrete, consensus that in the future we are going to try to avoid, and that we will act preemptively to avoid the problems that we had in the past.
But let me follow up and ask the same question that Minister Schäuble answered a moment ago. The long-term plan is in place. Everyone agrees on the long-term objectives. But what about the short-term?
But I think that, the difference between the long term and the short term, as Wolfgang has said, is a little bit, more confusing than many think. If we start to create a credible plan that creates confidence in the short term, I think that we are putting, the first steps in order to alleviate the shorter pressure that we are suffering right now. Again, it's very easy to think and to elaborate on the Greek situation, but I think that it's much more important, even in the short term, to have a credible plan in terms of fiscal union, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of commitment from the different member countries with this new situation. I think that would alleviate, that would mitigate many of the jittery that we are seeing right now in the markets.
So how big of a firewall would you like to see?
Well, I would not say any figure. I think that, the firewall has to be, big enough and flexible enough to avoid using it. And in order to avoid using this firewall, I think that, the main element that we have to take into consideration, the main element that we have to take in place is a new fiscal framework, a new corporate governance framework, and simultaneously, the commitment, the clear commitment of the different governments with, fiscal austerity and with structural reform. I think that if we have these three pillars in place, firewalls are there not to be used, to be a sort of deterrence.
Well, Iran, I'd like to get your comments on all of this, but from what you've heard so far, will this be enough to calm the markets and stop any dislocation, which of course would accelerate the problem?
I have a long time ago stopped predicting the behavior of the markets on the basis of policy decisions. But having said this, I think for the market forces who are present in this audience, I think there is one, I mean there are many, but one very important observation you can make. There is in fact quite strong unity among the ministers of the Eurozone and the European institutions as well as regards how we need to tackle this crisis. And in fact, while I know more or less how the Eurozone will look like, say, in 3 years, I must say that the next 3 days will be very crucial for that future of in 3 years. In other words, we are just about to close a deal on private sector involvement between the Greek government and the private creditor community. If not today, maybe over the weekend, but in any case, preferably still in January rather than in February. We are very close, and we have to have a sustainable solution for Greece, even if, as Wolfgang said, Greece is a special and unique case, and private sector involvement in that sense will not be applied to any other country of the Eurozone. And then we have two very important decisions related to this basic fair deal between reinforced fiscal discipline on the one hand and reinforced financial firewalls on the other hand. The treaty on new fiscal compact will be finalized on Monday, which will help create a much sturdier framework of the Eurozone economic governance. And then in parallel, the treaty on European Stability Mechanism will be concluded. This will be a very important 3-day period for reinforcing confidence into the Eurozone, and I'm sure that we will succeed in these decisions, and I hope, of course, that it will have a positive confidence-building impact on the market sentiment.
Let's talk about some of the ideas out there. Minister Schäuble, talk to us about the possibility of a Eurobond. Do we need a Eurobond? Mario Monti backed the idea before becoming Prime Minister. Who pays and what are the terms?
The problem of Eurobonds is as long as you don't have a structure in the European institutions, in the European treaties, to have similar structure for the fiscal policy, we have for the monetary policy, because the very specific situation in the European currency is we have a European common monetary policy. No member state has sovereignty in monetary policy. That is very specific. It's difficult to understand if you are abroad from Europe. But in Europe, we gave up parts of national sovereignty to the European institutions. And the monetary policy is a European monetary policy. We have a national fiscal policy, and that makes the problem. As long as we have not something like we are now doing, a fiscal union, to have a similar construction for fiscal discipline, as long common bonds gave the wrong incentives, because you may you spend money you don't have on the bill of others, and that is a wrong incentive in a functioning market economy. At the end, you have to pay your bills. If you spend on the risk of others, it's a temptation. Everyone will fail in avoiding such a temptation, and therefore we have to concentrate on building the structure for fiscal and even for a better competitiveness in the fiscal union. We knew when we created the European